everyone. We'll let everyone log in here. 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. We have a great webinar today with the great Darcy. We'll be talking about compensation strategy, pay equity, and transparency, a topic that is ever evolving. So we're doing a webinar on this today. We will definitely do a follow-up on this in 2025 and 2026 as well, because things continue to change. So it's a topic that definitely keep an eye on. I know when I've talked to people, I've been like, oh yeah, you have no idea what's coming. I don't really know, but Darcy told me stuff's coming. You got to pay attention. So that's my job, is to pass the word of Darcy. So it's 2:01. We're good to go. Brett Rogers here, HR covered, run partnerships, and have the pleasure of doing webinars with Darcy, which we really love in doing and enjoyed to do. Today, great webinar, compensation strategy, pay equity, and transparency. Same format as normal. Darcy is going to give a presentation, followed by a Q&A. Send any questions. We're going to get hit hard with questions today, so if we don't get to them, I apologize. I'm going to try and triage the ones that are most relevant. And then this is being recorded. It will be sent out on Monday, I believe. Don't quote me. And so if you registered and you did not make it, you get to watch it. So enough of me talking. You didn't come here for that. You came here for Darcy to talk about this fascinating and ever-evolving topic. Darcy, over to you.
Thanks for the introduction, Brett, and thanks for Sony behind the scenes. Hello, everyone. Welcome back, all of our regulars that seem to come to all of our webinars. We love you. This is awesome. And welcome to new clients, prospective clients, and just people that are interested in compensation in general. This is a great topic. I have to tell you, numbers has traditionally not been my thing. I'm fine with strategy. That's great. Putting the two together has been quite the journey for me. But this is something that should be on everybody's radar. I'm going to warn you in advance. Some of this might scare you a little bit. Some of this put it this way, some of this will challenge your conventional ideas about how you pay people. And it should challenge you, and you should be aware of it and know what's coming. Not to mention, this is here now, right? Compensation strategy is a real thing. 80% of companies do not have a compensation strategy, specifically smaller and medium companies. They just they pay out per year, and that's what it is. And that's fine, but might just change the way you think. So we're gonna jump right in because, as Brett said, we always get a lot of questions. We never are able to get to them all. And I suspect we'll get a lot of questions out of this one. So what is compensation strategy? Why is it so important? So right out of the gate, pay transparency, just to start with that, because so much of compensation strategy in today's world is about pay transparency, and pay transparency really drives your compensation strategy, or should at this point. Pay transparency is not just about salary disclosure. It's also about other things like full compensation. It's also about the criteria that you use for pay incentives, bonuses, promotions, et cetera, et cetera. So when people look at pay transparency, they get into this silo vision and they say, okay, whenever I do a job posting, I have to put how much money I'm going to pay for this job. It's more than that, and it's going to change. We've been there before. We'll talk about this a few times in this webinar, but we've been there before. We're likely going to come back to it in the future, at least in Ontario and BC for sure, because they're moving fast on this. So it's something that you need to be preparing for now, and I'll explain why. This is this was an interesting stat that I found, and it made me kind of resonate on why this is such an important topic. Employee compensation typically accounts for 40 to 70% of a company's costs for Canadian employers. So for larger companies, that might be a smaller percentage, but for smaller and medium-sized companies, what really drives your costs on a day-to-day basis is your payroll. And yet, even though it accounts for 40 to 70% of your costs, your overall operating costs, so little time and consideration is actually put in to how you pay your employees, to the strategy you have in place to pay your employees and what you want to get back from that. So compensation, to further to that point, compensation is a most powerful tool for employers. Again, not realized, but it is your opportunity, compensation strategy, to actually drive the responsibilities, to drive the way you influence behavior, to drive performance, to motivate your employees, to increase recruitment and retention. Yet most employers, and I deal with a lot of you that are on this call, or on this webinar, I deal with you on the day-to-day, and I know it's something you want to look at, it's something you're aware of, but it still reverts back because it's easy, and that makes sense. Like, you got a business to run, right? This isn't the first thing you're thinking about, but most employers still revert to annual pay increases, paying out COLA, which is cost of living expenses for those who don't know, or simply, oh, we have an employee, they're an A player, they're threatening to leave, let's give them a raise. And that's their compensation strategy, right? It's 40 to 70% of your overall costs, yet that's the way you're managing your compensation system. And that's problematic in itself, understandable, but problematic in itself, but it's about to become more problematic in the years to come. Base salary, and this is important, because one of the problems with compensation strategy, especially with medium to bigger size companies, is they say, you know what, this is the compensation strategy we have in place. It's great, it works for us. Our recruitment's solid, our retention's great. Then COVID comes. Now all of a sudden, other things are more important to employees, and now the compensation strategy you had that worked no longer is working anymore. Your recruitment is harder, your retention is going down, and you can't figure out why. Compensation strategy should always be reevaluated for more than just your base salary. That is only one of 5 primary factors that drive people in the market when they're choosing their employer of choice. You should be looking at things like paid time off, recognition, benefits, pension, et cetera, et cetera. All of those are part of full compensation, and that should evolve as part of your compensation strategy. So that's something that's really important to kind of keep in mind. And this is another thing, and this is a little bit more macro, it's a little bit higher end as far as compensation strategy, but we're going to talk about it. And the next time we do a webinar, it might even come involved in some of the questions. The next time we do a webinar, we'll talk about this alignment between HR strategy and compensation strategy. And I did notice in one of the questions that came in prior, someone obviously knows a little bit something about this because they asked a question along this lines, but compensation strategy is about your compensation and how that helps you achieve your goals from that aspect. HR strategy is more macro, right? HR strategy is about every aspect of your people power in your business. And if one doesn't align with the other, if your idea about how from an HR perspective to recruit and retain employees doesn't align with your compensation structure and how you're going to get better performance out of those said employees, which actually might cause them to go away if you're being too forceful, then you're going to have a problem. You're spending a lot of money and time over here. You're spending a lot of sweat equity over here. And if those two things don't match, you're not going to get the desired outcomes you want. So we're going to talk about that briefly today. But again, that's a little bit under the macro and probably save for the next presentation when we get there on this one. So again, compensation strategy makes up a lot of things. Right now, the thing that should be on your radar, because it's being, I don't want to say forced down your throat, it's being legislated accordingly, right? Pay transparency is the thing that should be a primary focus for pay fairness and pay transparency. And there's a difference. I'll explain it later. But pay transparency is a thing that should be on your radar right now. What does that look like in Canada, right? So first off, right now, what pay transparency looks in Canada, and it's going to change next year, by the way. For BC, this is going to change. It's already legislated. It's going to happen in Ontario. It's going to happen. There's already new legislation that's not been tabled yet, but has already been discussed and going to be put out. And it's going to get worse if the Liberal Party gets in. We'll talk about that. Politics, there's a lot of politics in this entire subject. So you have to bear with me, but it's important to understand, right? The ranges when you post a job now, in the paper, online, on Indeed, wherever, even internally, you have to post the range for that job, right? Why is that important just by itself? Why is this scaring the crap out of employers right now? Because out of COVID, when the market was really fierce and it was hard, it was an employee market. So you had to overpay to get A quality talent. You're hiring these people for 20% more than what you would have paid 5 years ago, which means those people that have been working for you for 5 years and are A players are getting paid almost the same as the people that you're hiring now. And now those employees that are sitting in your desk and have been working for you for 5 years can see it. It's no longer a secret. It's no longer something you say to a new employee, don't talk about this or you're going to be fired, which is illegal, by the way, in Ontario anyways, and some other jurisdictions anyways. But besides the point, pay transparency brings in, it's a competitive thing. It allows people that have been around for a while to say, am I being underpaid? Am I being overpaid? When people are looking for jobs and they have two of the very similar jobs, and this job has a salary range of 80 to 90, and this job has a salary range of 100 to 110, who do you think is going to be their job of choice? It forces employers to pay what employees are worth, not what they think they can get that employee for. And there's a big difference. That makes you an employer of choice, by the way. So in Canada, in 2021, PEI had pay transparency legislation. That was followed by Newfoundland, and then a year later in British Columbia in 2023. This includes, and these are the major things of all three of those legislations: salary disclosure and postings. You can no longer ask, and there's a reason for this, and I'll explain it really quickly. You can no longer ask for the history. What did you get paid at your last job? Why is that important? And for some of you, are going to get on my soapbox here just a little bit. For a lot of you that have, worked with me over the time at HR Covered or been on this webinars, you know that systemic discrimination exists. We all know that. If you're an HR person or a business owner, you know systemic discrimination exists. So if you ask a white male dude, and you say, and you're in an executive position, what did you get paid at your last job? Well, I got paid about 125. And then you ask a female lady, or female lady, and then you ask a female doing the exact same job, what have you, and ask them what they did in their last job, they might say 110. And the reason they're getting paid $15,000 less than that male dude is because over the years of systemic discrimination, that woman has been paid less than the man for doing the less job. So hence, you're paying for what you can get that employee for, not what they're worth, right? Not what the equal male comparator is worth. So you're no longer allowed. And that goes with all visible minorities, right? All visible minorities. You are no longer allowed to ask someone what they made in their last job, so you could try and figure out what's the least amount of money you could pay to get that employee to work for you, right? So that's gone. You can no longer forbid employees from discussing salary. So even at one point, going past 2 years ago, it was made part of the ESA, you could actually put into an employment agreement, if you discuss your salary, you may be disciplined up to and including termination with cause. You can no longer do that in any of these jurisdictions that have pay transparency legislation. Manitoba and Ontario then followed. Manitoba's legislation, very similar to what the ones we mentioned prior, that did not pass the floor, but it was a private member's bill put forth by the NDP party. The NDP party is now in power in Manitoba. Expect Manitoba to have pay transparency legislation within the year. Okay, Ontario has the exact same thing. Ontario went a step further, and I have to applaud this just because I'm not a big fan of it in this one sense. They actually went so far as to restrict the use of AI in hiring processes, which has become a very popular practice for medium and especially large-sized businesses, where they stick in the AI process, and they start to look for answers that they don't like. They start to look for things. Well, when you have different levels of equity, when you have different levels of wage earners, you have different levels of ethnicity, all these different things, AI can't account for that. So inherently, AI has the potential of becoming discriminatory in its process, right? So now in Ontario, if you are using AI in your hiring process, you have to disclose that to the candidates in advance and ask for their permission to continue with the AI, with the hiring process, which includes AI, which is kind of revolutionary in Ontario. It's the first province to have done it. Now, this is an interesting stat, and this is part of the reason why I said from the beginning, this is going to challenge some of the people on this webinar about what they have thought about compensation strategy traditionally. 40% of candidates, and these stats are right up through the beginning of 2024. So this is also hot stove that all the stats we're using right now, like usually you get a stat, it's a year old, it's 2 years old. These stats are all 2024. That's how hot stove this issue is right now. And they're getting you ready for what's going to happen in the next 2 years. 40% of candidates will not apply for a job if it does not have a salary post, if it does not have their salary posted. It's a waste of their time, quite frankly. And if you're not bold enough and confident enough to post a salary for your position, they probably don't want to work for you because the salary is probably not good enough. And that's the mentality, that's the logic, right? Doesn't make it right, doesn't mean they are right. It's just, that's the logic, that's the mentality. 59%, so almost 60% of people before they apply for a job have researched how much they believe the job that they're applying for is worth. So when even if you don't post and they decide to post for it, and then in the first interview, you tell them what how much the job pays, they already know what it's going to be in the range of. And if you're not there, they're walking out. They might, out of courtesy, finish the interview and waste your time as well. But in fairness, you didn't post the wage, you kind of wasted their time out of the jump, right? And now this is the great stat. 70% of current and future employees know what their job range is. So now you have 70% of your own employees who know what their job that they do is paid for. And they also know what they're getting paid, obviously. They don't necessarily know what their colleagues are getting paid yet, but they will soon. And they're also going to know what other companies are paying for. It's actually forcing employers to be as competitive as the market needs them to be, right? And it's a challenge for employers. It's going to get worse, but that's why we're doing this now. That's why we're doing this ahead of the game, because it's going to take some time. Every company that I've ever worked with has inequities in their compensation system. Somewhere along the lines, two people that do the almost exact same work, one of them is getting paid about 5 to 10% higher than this person. And for whatever reason, and there's probably reasons, but there's nothing to show why this person is getting paid higher than this person. And if there's nothing to show why this person is getting paid this much doing the exact same work as this person who's doing the exact same work, and you can't qualify that with actual quantifiable data and criteria, at a certain point, the government's going to say, this person here has to be bumped up. Doesn't matter if they're a bad employee. You can't show me why this person is a good employee, so this person's need to be bumped up. That's where we're headed. And we'll talk about that in I think one more slide. And that's where I'm going with this. To fix this, and I have permission. I've had this asked whether I do this or not. I have permission to talk about this client because they're a great client, and they took the initiative last year to do the whole performance to pay thing, the whole bit. They went through the whole gamut of everything that you need to put together a comprehensive compensation strategy and plan that will be enforceable and compliant for years to come. And they got to the point where, when I laid all the numbers in front of them, they had about $150,000 in pay inequities that they had to fix, right? And so when eventually this legislation is going to come to all of you, and they're going to say, you have 6 months to get this done, and you're going to be faced with that decision of having to figure out, where am I going to get this $150,000 to fix this within the next 6 months. These folks did this last year. We came up with a plan, a 4-year plan, to fix that $115,000 inequity over 4 years. So it's going to hit them, right? It's going to hit them. It's going to build morale. It's going to build recruitment and retention because they're doing it right. But they had 4 years to fix these inequities that inevitably are in everybody's plan, right? That's why we're encouraging everybody to do this now, because you need the time to span out what would be the proverbial damage that you may or may not find in your compensation system when you start to break it down for what it is. So again, we talked about pay transparency, and pay transparency is just being, open and transparent about what you pay, how you pay it, how people get raises. Pay fairness is different. Pay fairness isn't about just being open and pay equity and all that kind of stuff. It's about paying people. It's the principle of paying equal work for equal pay, regardless of whether you're part-time, seasonal, full-time, woman, man, Hispanic, what have you. It's about paying equal work for equal pay. And this is the part that you need to get ahead of, because this is where we're going. We'll talk about Europe, we'll talk about the United States, but this is where we're going in Canada, and it's coming faster than even I expected. And I had this on my radar a couple years back. So in the EU Economic Union, they passed a pay transparency directive, and it was signed into law in 2023. So for you, those of you that are in HR, for the people on the call that are in HR, if you ever want to do great studies on best practices, and this is something that it's pet peeve. I'm kind of narcissistic. I like to read case law, and I like to read best practices about stuff like this. Whenever I want to do a best practice about human resources, I always look to the European countries. They're so far ahead of us in everything. It's kind of a joke, really, in one aspect, that we have fallen this far behind, especially for a left-wing leaning kind of country such as Canada. But the EU is ahead of us. And this is what their law says, just so you know where they're at right now. On request, employers must provide employees with information about pay ranges and categories, and at any point, they can look at any comparable employee within their workplace and say that I want a wage comparison based on the principle of equal work for equal pay. So it's not just saying, okay, I make this much and this person makes this much. They have the right to ask you the criteria. How is this job graded relative to my job? So the way you do that, it's categories of workers must be defined. And this is when I talked about criteria, about how do you take this person that's making $100,000 and this person that's making $95,000? How do you justify the difference when they have the same experience, they do basically the same job, but there's a couple of little differences? How do you define the difference between that person making $5,000 more and this person making $5,000 less? It's the criteria, it's the bona fide criteria of your job, and you have to grade it. So you take responsibilities, you take how much of their work is done outside, how much of their work is done inside, what's their budget powers, all these different things. And then you grade each one of those factors, and you grade them accordingly, and then you treat them relatively, and then you scale jobs to see which one gets paid more than the other. And you have quantifiable criteria about the levels of work each job entails, the level of responsibility each job entails, about the level of experience and qualification and education each job entails. And then that way you come up with a quantifiable pay grid. And that's what in the European Economic Union, they're allowed to do right now, as of last year, matter of fact. So this is the way we're headed. Just so you know that this isn't completely a European thing, for those folks in Ontario, you may remember this. I grinched my teeth. I already grind my teeth anyways. That's why they're all chipped and all that. But I grind my teeth every time I think back about these days. But quite frankly, we're on our way back. If you recall, back in 2018, the Fair Workplaces Better Jobs Act was implemented by the Wynne Liberal government. Basically what this said was, and this is a version of it, this is the final version. This was not the first reading of it. The first reading I'll get to in a second, but basically what this said is that casual, part-time, temporary, and seasonal employees would be paid the same as full-time employees who do the same work. So it's traditional that when you have a full-time employee doing a certain job, that you pay them, say, for the sake of $30 an hour for doing that job. But if you had a part-time employee doing the same job, you might pay them $25 an hour because there's not the same commitment. They're doing other work. There's a whole bunch of different reasons why you would use transactional labor and pay them less versus full-time labor and pay them more. This bill that was passed, by the way, basically said you can't do that. If it's the same job, they get paid the exact same money, regardless of what status they were. And in the first reading, it wasn't just about the issue of you saying, actually, I think I get to that anyways. I'll get back. I'll skip back to that. The caveat to this was there was a second part to it. Not only did it say that all these people would have to be paid the same, it also said that if anybody was paid different, if anybody was ever given a raise or a bonus or a promotion, you had to show why that person was given that raise and bonus or promotion. In other words, when I started this presentation, I'm just gonna take a look at time. When I started this presentation, I talked about, the way we typically all do things. 90% of us on this call. We typically just say, okay, we're gonna give a raise at the end of the year, or we had a good year, here's a bonus, or this person's, whining about not making enough money, but we need them. So we're gonna listen to the whining and we're gonna give them what they want and we're gonna keep them, or we give a COLA. Under the system that the Wynne government introduced, you could not do that. That was not allowed. You would actually have to have a system in place that said the only way you could justify giving this person a raise that does the same job and not giving this person a raise is to say on basis of merit, which you had to quantify, on systems that determine pay or quantity or quality by production, a seniority system, or other factors. And other factors is there's a whole caveat, a whole bucket of things that you could put in there. It just can't be sex, money, ethnicity, any of that kind of stuff. So back in the day, and this was passed, I want to make sure you understand, this was actually passed by Parliament, okay? Which brings us to I don't know how I did that. I actually honestly don't know how I did this. So that goes back to the point I was making earlier. Sorry, I'm talking fast. I know we're running short on time. When you look at the work, when I introduced the the Workplace Better Jobs Act in 2018, and I said it's only applying to these specific types of classes relative to full-time employment, when it first came out, it applied to everybody. So it applied to full-time employees compared to other full-time employees, which basically means that if you were a full-time employee making 100 grand a year, and there was two other full-time employees making 110 grand a year, and after you pointed out all of the criteria that was required by this law, if they pointed out the same, you had to bump that person up $10,000. It wasn't, you couldn't down these people $10,000. You couldn't fire that person. You literally had to bump that person up $10,000. Folks, I'm telling you right now, the Liberal government back in the day, when the election came the next year after this happened, or within the same year after they passed this legislation, it was so not well received that not only did they not win the election, they lost party status. That's how poorly this was received. But let's flip it back now to the 6 jurisdictions, soon to be 6 jurisdictions, that now have pay transparency legislation. One of them being Ontario, who is, by the way, is led by a progressive, or sorry, a conservative candidate in Rob Ford, who introduced what would be liberal legislation, pay transparency legislation, under his leadership, which basically means that he's trying to appease both parties. Should there be a swing, as there is in Manitoba, to the NDP party, and there should be a similar swing to the Liberal Party in Ontario or in British Columbia, you should expect this to be upon you within the next year or two, right? And like it's not like gambling. It's not like it's again, you can look backwards to look forwards and see where we're going. So really quickly, you all get a copy of this presentation. If you're honored, if you're registered and you can make it today, you're all going to get a copy of this. So I'm going to go through this slide really quick. What does the development of a compensation strategy look like? Here's your objectives. And these aren't all of them, but these are the ones I choose. Compliance, fairness, competitiveness in the market. The things that your compensation strategy should be driving: great company culture, good recruitment and retention, high performance, high morale. If you have a compensation strategy in place that just isn't, oh, you don't like your job, or you could go get somewhere else, get money somewhere else, here's a raise, or oh, pay a living cost went up 3%, we'll give you 3%. That you're wasting your money. Like, you're wasting your money. You could have a compensation package that actually drives people to get a better company culture, to get better recruitment and retention, to actually get better performance from your employees, and reward them for performance where you wouldn't reward them if their performance was poor. The process, here's the most important part out of the gate. Anybody who does a compensation plan, and I do some consulting for HR Covered, like I run the consulting department well, and I've had conversations with some of the people who might be on this phone call. I'm not sure who's on it, but we go through this process and I say, I can't do a compensation strategy for you unless you do this first. Otherwise, you're just throwing darts at a board. You have no idea where you're going with it. You have no idea whether you're compliant with pay equity. You definitely have no idea whether you're compliant with job equity, which is pay fairness. Job descriptions are key. Your job descriptions have to be done properly. They have to be tied to numbers. They have to be tied to KPIs. They just can't be, oh, here's how much, this is what we need you to do. This is what the education you need to have. Like, you could go to the newspaper and get that. A job description has to be an accurate overall evaluation of someone's job and what it entails. A job analysis, way more complicated to describe. It's a whole other webinar by itself, but basically it's all those things we talked about earlier. You take key responsibilities for every single job, and then you start pointing them, and then you scale the jobs based on the amount of points, and that's who gets paid the most. Is probably that white collar worker who has high budgetary control, has responsibility for a whole bunch of people, has all these different things, has all these qualifications that you need to get into the role. They'll get a whole bunch of points, and hence that's why they get paid what they get paid. And then a market analysis to see where that job with the criteria set ends up in the market, right? If you could do those three things right there and then, you have the basis for a great compensation strategy and compensation plan. It's expensive because it's time consuming, and it requires data that about 3 or 4 companies in Canada hold exclusively. So whenever you do this, you have to buy the data, whether it be through a company like us who has to buy it from them, or directly from them, which makes, they'll only sell it to you in a year membership, which makes it very expensive. But yeah, it's worth it. The next couple of steps, this is where the evolution of compensation strategy goes. From once you have all this data that you needed, the job descriptions analysis, market analysis, the compliance aspect of it, pay equity, building pay structures, pay bands and pay grids. Not a deep leap. Once you got all this done, it's not a deep leap to get to the second point. This is where you make the jump. This is where the value is when you start to evolve your pay compensation strategy, or your compensation strategies, to performance-based evaluation, merit pay, and bonus systems. Once you start tying the KPIs that are in your performance management to your actual compensation, that's where you start getting value for your dollar. For every dollar you spend in additional compensation, if you have it tied into that, you will make $10 ROI, and you're guaranteed. And that's why it's a lot of money up front, but it's a huge investment. And then finally, the final step, budgeting, information, communication, ongoing evaluation. That goes with any process that you do in HR or finance for that matter. But certainly it's a consideration. And I only say this, it's what I said earlier, you're gonna find inequities. Once you start to do this, you're gonna find inequities. You're gonna have to budget it out. The more time you have to spread out that fixing of the inequities, the more time you have. Not only that, we actually provide, and I'm just going to use us as an example because I'm biased, right? And I have the information. We actually provide pretty reasonable costs for compensation analysis and development compensation strategy, but that's because we do about 5 to 10 of these for clients a month. In 2 years' time or a year's time from now, I expect we'll be doing 30 to 40 of these a month for clients, because they're going to have to do it then. It's not going to be the same price. So getting ahead of this now is not only beneficial on the price point, but it also gives you more time to plan and prepare. Quick slide. I know we got a ton of Q&A. I can see all the questions coming in, which is great. But just about what we do: compliance, health and safety, employee lifecycle, HR strategy. We do consulting, which is what this is part of. Great consulting team we have. Recruitment, we have a phenomenal. We have the HRC law is the only legal product in all of Canada where you can pay one price and get unlimited limited legal advice. So a lot of our clients are now starting to buy into that. They have HR covered on one side, so they get us, the consultants, and then they also have our lawyers, which is great. It's a great marriage. And just one other thing, just to touch on it, for those people who are already HR covered clients and you haven't found out yet, we've added, is it six new training courses to our library. They're all great, like office ergonomics, all these different things. They're great courses. If you have a training membership, they're free to you. Definitely jump in. For our exact HR clients in Quebec, we've added 2 new modules, both in French. So we've listened to what you folks are looking for. We're really trying to build out our support that way. Hopefully for any of you who have watched those modules yet, you love them. I'm going to shut up now, give it back to Brett, get a drink of water, get ready to answer your questions. Oh,
all right.
That's
Darcy.
my dog.
Yeah,
My
have
dog.
some water. Have some water.
My dog.
Yeah, very interesting. Just going back to your point there about job posting. I used to do recruiting, and obviously you do what the client wants. But one of the challenges when you get a client in recruiting, sorry, my camera. One of the challenges when we would have a client in recruiting when they were adamant on not posting the salary or a salary range. And it always made it very difficult because it's really hard for the prospect to know, well, what am I dealing with here? And so it kind of creates a waste of time for everyone. So I've always been a fan of having the range, but some of these things are obviously, a lot more enforceable or powerful. I don't know the right word for that. So anyways, let's jump into the questions. I enjoyed that. And again, that's a topic that is ever evolving. Just a reminder, this is being recorded. There's been a few questions about that, and it will be sent out on Monday. So let's jump into it, Darce. Okay. Does pay equity extend to all minorities or just male and female employees?
That's a good question because it's kind of misunderstood. Pay equity, ironically, is about female and male competitors. That's it. It doesn't necessarily extend to minorities. Pay fairness does. There's never been any legislation, and this is just the tradition of it all. I guess it's trying to make it simple. Is the first really inequity that was ever noticed. Before we had a lot of immigration and a lot of merging in of different races and what have you into our country. There's never been a need for it. It's just been about women and male. So outside of creating pay equity for every single classification of worker, I think they just moved to a more generic kind of philosophy about pay fairness and say equal pay for equal work. It doesn't matter whether you're black, white, Hispanic, what have you. That's the move to it. But yeah, pay equity by itself, if you were a black male, pay equity doesn't work for you. That process, as far as the legislation that's laid out for you, it's just not accessible there.
Okay. We have a pay grid that we developed years back based on market analysis. Should that page be reviewed?
Yes. Sorry. Yeah. No. I thought that question was going somewhere else. The thing about a pay grid is that you do your market analysis to look at where your pay should be at that point, and then you give pay increases as you go. But the actual positions itself still evolve within the marketplace. And there's so many factors that will evolve those positions, especially big factors like COVID, which no one would ever predict to see coming and no one ever wants to see again, but it happens, right? The election in the United States will inevitably affect pay cycles in Canada. Same with the election in Canada. But what happens out of that will inevitably change jobs. So if I had somebody ask me right now, should I do an evaluation of my job grid right now? I'm saying, no, wait till after November 15th. But yeah, every 3 to 4 years, you should do an evaluation of your entire pay grid and all the positions in it to make sure it's current. Great that you have a system in place, but if it's outdated or stale, it could actually serve to be defeatist.
Okay, this comes back to my point that I brought up before we started the Q&A. My reading of the legislation is that we have to provide a salary range in the job posting, not an exact salary. How big can the salary range be?
Okay, so that's actually a really good question because we get this a lot and there's no real definitive answer. All of the pay transparency legislation where it talks about range has never provided the use of words reasonable. It uses the word all these different things, but it never talks about what exactly that range may be. So what you're seeing now, and this is the stats that bear out right into 2024, so really recent. What you're seeing now is 2 years ago as compared to now, 28% more employers are actually posting their ranges of the pay in their postings, which brings it up closer to about 48%. But the 28% are the ones that are required. The 28% were the ones who were doing voluntarily. Now you're up to about 48%, I think the number was. The pay ranges, however, from 2 years ago have went from about a 6% pay, like when you look at the pay range, it was about a 6% differential. Now it's closer to 15%. So these companies are taking advantage, and some could argue that's good on them for taking advantage of this kind of loophole or latitude. Others could argue it's taking advantage in not an ethical way, but they're taking advantage of the fact that there's no strict definition of what that range should be, only that it should be reasonable, and saying, instead of saying this job is going to pay 80 to 85,000, this job will pay 80 to 95,000, and that's a big diff. You know what I mean? That's a big diff for candidates. So yeah, that's what you're seeing right now. So it's up to you from, the pay range there, it's up to you and like an ace recruitment person before he became even a better partnership person than Brett to say, what's the best strategy for us as a company to be able to recruit effectively?
Okay. Are you suggesting that it's possible that we may not be able to provide a high performing employee with a raise or reward when we feel it has been earned?
Correct. That's right now you can. Right now you can.
Right now, but in the future, you're saying that you may not be able to.
If you look at it let's look at it from this perspective. If you were in the European Union, no, you can't. You just can't do that. Oh, you know what? This person's a rock star. They had a great quarter. Let's give them a big raise, right? If you had a merit system that said this person's a rock star and they met this criteria and they had this much performance, or they had this much performance, which turned into this much ROI for the company, and that was laid out, and everybody was part of that system, as so you could compare one employee to another, absolutely. But if you just get up in the morning and say, I don't want to lose this person, I'm going to give them a $10,000 raise, and you have no merit system, if what comes to be, which I believe will come to be within the next 2 years, that once was in 2018, you would not be able to do that. And if you did that and another employee complained, and the Ministry of Labor, the Labor Board, whomever it was, depending on what jurisdiction you're in, came in and take a look at that, and you could not show that you're giving this person a raise and show the criteria that was used to give that person a raise and not give this person a raise, you would have to give that person the raise too.
Yeah.
That's where we're headed.
So this is kind of a follow-up, but different question. When you're discussing factors that justify a wage for an employee, you said other factors on the slide. What is an example of other factors?
Yeah, it's kind of a bucket. There's tons of stuff you could throw in there. The thing that comes to mind for me, like right out of the gate, is that when you look at the things that were listed there, like merit, production, seniority. If somebody, for example, went back to school and upgraded they got another license, or they went for us HR folks out there, you're a CHRP, and then you became a CHR, whatever the next leader, CHRL. So you moved up your level of designation. That would be something that could be considered another factor because it's quantifiable. The only thing that when you look at the actual legislation from 2018, the only thing that it stated is those other factors would be taken into consideration on a case-by-case basis. However, any factors that include sex, age, protected status is basically in the Human Rights Code would be dismissed, and you wouldn't be allowed to use them.
Are we required to provide a cost of living increase every year by law?
No, I don't know. Like, I know this is a union thing. So much of what, especially in Canada, and actually more so in a lot of states, but a lot in Canada, so much of what a lot of employees' understanding of what is required of employers and what's not comes from labor management, comes from the unionized environment. There is nothing, when the minimum wage goes up, if you have employees that are making more than minimum wage, you're not required to bump them. When inflation goes up every year, you're not required, as long as they're getting paid minimum wage, unless you're contractually bound otherwise, as long as an employee is getting minimum wage, you have no legal responsibility to give anyone a raise at all. Will you keep them? No. Will they be happy if you do keep them? No. But as far as legal responsibility, as long as they're getting paid minimum wage, that's it. That's the only responsibility in any jurisdiction in Canada.
Good question here. We have both white collar and blue collar positions. How would a job analysis work in our case?
That is a good question, because that's, again, job analysis is it's a complicated thing, which is why it's a little, but anyways, it's a complicated thing. But basically you're taking, for the most part, you could separate white collar if they're definitely two different types of position, like office versus shop. You could separate them and do two different types of job analysis, because there's no point doing a job analysis for someone in the office where it says maybe must have to wear protective equipment, has to work outside. So in cases like that, but if you have white collar and blue collar within, like, say, an office environment, you would use the same job analysis tool. The thing is, when you get to the certain parts of the job analysis tool, you're going to get to things like amount of people they have to manage, amount of budget control they have, amount of discretion they have, amount of liability they have, expectations around hours of work. So right there, for example, if you're a manager and executive, expectations around hours of work, that might be an 8 for a manager and a 10 for an executive. Whereas if you are a non-manager, in other words, you are entitled to overtime, your expectations for hours of work might be a 2, because you're not expected to work more than 44 hours in a week, right? And they can't make you work more than 44 hours a week unless unless that's in your contract. So when you start to look at it, you could still, even though you have blue collar and white collar employees in one company, when you start to grade it out, you're going to see a lot of grades down here for the blue collar workers, in some cases, not all, where there's a lot of high grades, and up here there's going to be a lot of low grades or nothing. And it's going to be the opposite on the other side. And typically in a good job analysis, those things are given more weight. Not everything is given more weight. Someone who has liability, like anybody, when you have 2 employees and one of those employees has liability, if they screw up their job, that factor will be given more weight in a proper job analysis than someone that just has to show up 9 to 5, check out, done. And no matter what they do, no matter how badly they screw up, they're never going to be the ones getting sued at the end of the day. So, that's a job analysis is really, it's a comparison of 2 different jobs, but it's the skill sets and requirements within the jobs that actually allow you to tier the jobs to where they should be as far as pay scale goes.
We currently provide raises to employees who have good performance appraisals at the end of the year. So would we be okay under a potential new system?
If it has criteria. Back to that, the answer that I provided earlier. If the pay raises, like the problem with one of the best things, and people that have watched webinars that I've done over the years know I was an advocate of working from home. And part of the reason I was an advocate of working from home is because you could focus on output. It wasn't about presentism or seeing that person working at that desk for 2 hours later every night and thinking, oh, they're a great employee, they're really loyal, instead of in the back of your mind thinking it really takes them 2 hours longer than everybody else to get their job done. So that's all arbitrary. Like that whole thought process really. So when you get 5 different managers, like in a nursing home is a perfect example, because we have a lot of nursing homes clients. So you'll have 5 different managers on different night shifts and day shifts and what have you, and they're all grading these people on the same tool. And this one manager is grading somebody who's clearly, in my opinion, not a great employee, but giving them great grades. And this other manager is saying, yeah, you're an average employee. But there's no matrix. There's nothing to say that this person's opinion is full of crap and this person's opinion is full of crap, but they end up on the upper end of the spectrum. That's what they're trying to eliminate. They're trying to eliminate the arbitrariness. There should be a scorecard. There should be clear goals and a scorecard that this person has to reach every goal, right? This person must meet this criteria. If they meet this criteria, they get a 3. If they meet this much criteria, they get a 4. And that way, no matter who's doing the judging, it's always going to fit into that criteria. And in that way, if that's your performance management system, absolutely. That's a great system and they deserve raises and you'll get ROI on it. But if it's just, Pam over there likes Mike, thinks he's a great worker, and they hang out after dinner, they hang out after work and have beers with the group, and he keeps on getting great performance appraisals, we have to give him a raise. Is that your compensation strategy?
So here's a good question. Will benefits be included in compensation strategy, and or will other employees know who's getting what?
Yeah, and that's an interesting question, because pay transparency, depending on how it's laid out in each jurisdiction, is a little bit different. Right now, pay transparency is salary. That's what they're asking you to post. In traditional pay transparency, and definitely pay fairness, which is what was under the Wynne government and is in the European Union, is full compensation. So now we work with a lot of benefit companies as well. So I advise them, when we talk to them, we're going to have a good chat tomorrow with one of our benefit partners. When we talk about this, I say, you have to be mindful when you're advising your clients about benefits. I go, that counts as part of their full remuneration package. So, you can't just give this one person this benefit and somebody in the same employment class a lesser benefit. That's not equitable. And when you look at the traditional sense of definitely pay fairness, but pay transparency as well, then yeah, it's the same thing. But for what the reporting requirements are right now at this point in time, it's not. But you should definitely be, whenever you're looking at your compensation strategy, not from a requirement point of view, but for what you as a company want to get out of it. Reaching your goals and have your compensation strategy support your growth and the achievement of your goals. Benefits, pension, pay time off, flexibility, all those different things should account for part of your compensation strategy.
We're a small business and we can't always afford to give raises or bonuses. Will there be another way to, is there another alternative as far as a strategy is concerned?
Actually, the answer to the last question is more appropriate for this question than not. It's what is when you're looking at your total package, right? And we encourage it. We have clients call us all the time, and we have, and Brett, this, our largest percentage of clients are non-for-profits because we're affordable. And we have a lot of our HR advisors, including myself, with a history working with non-for-profits, so we're empathetic that way. And we get the call. We have funding. We have limited money. What can we do? Is there anything non-monetary we can do? And there are things like pizza lunches. I know it's monetary, but really, and then there are like paid days off, like dress down Fridays, all these different things you don't think it's part of the actual overall compensation package, but in fact they are. When things like benefits are so important, especially when it comes around financial security, which is what I'm going to be talking about tomorrow with trends in about benefits and benefit industry from an HR perspective. Financial security right now is, when they talk about mental stress being the number one reason why people are going off on leave, the number one reason why people have mental stress is because financial insecurity, right? So it's like a line. So when you're looking at your overall compensation plan and you're a smaller, medium-sized business and you do provide benefits to your employee, the most important meeting you're going to have that year is with your benefit broker to sit down and talk about how can I make my benefit package more appealing to not the traditional 2 people, 3 kids, blah 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 that was 2 decades ago, to the more work style life balance, 1 to 2 kids max, appreciate these different types of things. How can I make my benefits package more appealing? That is a way where it's going to cost you no more money than it would now, but by looking and being creative and ingenuitive about how you take what you have existing and make it work for your existing client base and what they want, not what you want or think they want, what they want, then you could actually spend the same amount of money you're doing now and have a better compensation strategy than you did before.
Okay. We've always taken the strategy, let the market decide regarding compensation. What do you think about that in the future?
If the marketplace is going to drive your compensation or drive your goals and your how to achieve them and your outcomes and your recruitment and retention, if the marketplace is capable of doing that for you, then that's a great compensation strategy. Where in fact, everybody knows that the marketplace does not care about any single company. For example, if you're going to say that if that's your philosophy, then when the marketplace is in the dumper, does that mean that you're just going to give up on your business for that year? And just say, oh, the marketplace isn't good right now, we can afford our place. When stocks are low, that's when you buy in. So it's the exact opposite philosophy. I get the idea that it's supply and demand, and that's traditional old school HR, like dinosaur stuff, and there's some merit to it. When supply is high, when demand is but anyways, when there's lots of employees out there and there's only a few little jobs, in other words, the marketplace is poor, you don't have to pay employees as much, and that might work for you, but then the opposite doesn't always work for you. So you really, when you're talking about compensation strategy, you should be looking at what you want to achieve and how your compensation strategy can help you get there, and the marketplace should be very secondary to anything you do. But I get it. I get the statement. I understand why that, because it is a philosophy that has existed for decades and decades on end.
So this is a statement, but I'm going to change it into a question. Will compensation strategy look different for not-for-profits compared to for-profits because people are not always motivated by money?
Yes, absolutely. I can tell you right now, and if she's on this call, I never asked for permission, but it's very much a compliment. I talked to an ED from a non-for-profit last week, and she had a very enlightening view of non-for-profits and the fact that anymore, with inflation being what it is, that she has a lot of employees that are true about what they do, what they deliver, what they do for the community. But at the end of the day, they still need to put food on the table for their family. And I think that gap with where we're at right now has tightened. And I feel bad for non-for-profits in that way. Non-for-profits, you're always going to have, and this is always going to be your dilemma. You're always going to have a portion of your employee base that is there because they believe in what you're doing, and they're willing to take a little bit less money than what they might get in the marketplace because it's a not-for-profit and the goal. But then you're going to have the rest of the employees, and you can't say to the rest of the employees, we're going to pay you less because we're going after these employees, and you can't say to these employees, we're going to pay you less and pay these people more because you'll take less. So you have to, yes, absolutely. The way you market, the way you brand, what you bring to the table as far as community and what that means to your employees is an important part of your compensation strategy. And there's effective ways to do that. And if you're a client of HR Covered, send me an email. I'll sit down and have that conversation with you because there's effective ways to do that. But by itself, it's not a game changer anymore in this economy.
Makes sense. Okay. Does years of service factor into pay equity? If you have to compare two individuals doing the same job, one has been there for 20 years, the other for 5 years, there will be a difference as the tenured employee has been receiving wage increases throughout the years.
Absolutely, 100%. When you look at pay equity, it's not, pay equity is a little bit easier than pay fairness. Pay equity is more because you're only comparing male to female comparators, and you're comparing male dominated jobs to female dominated classes, right? So there's a little bit of a difference there, but it's expected that within each band of a male dominated job or a female dominated job, and you're comparing one to the other, that there's going to be differences based on seniority, merit, things of that nature. Seniority is easy. Seniority is easy to justify. So they're not, pay equity does not demand that you pay a female that has been working there for 5 years the same as a male that's been working there for 10 years. That's not what pay equity does. It does demand that if you have a female that's been working there for 10 years and a male that's been working there for 10 years, and that female that's getting paid less, it does demand that you pay the same.
Good question about cross-border. Is there any pay equity strategies for a company that operates in the US and Canada? For example, if we offer $59,000 USD for a receptionist, which is entry level in the US, that is equivalent to $81,000 in Canada, which is more than we want to offer for a financial analysis, which is a mid-level position. So will there be anything with that to consider? It's a good question.
It's a great question because we have so many American-based clients and we're getting more like on the daily. But at this point, there's nothing because pay equity legislation is governed via jurisdiction, like most things in Canada, and it's also there's a national. It's one of the few things that has both provincial or jurisdictional and national as well. But kind of, it's more so the human rights application, human rights code as it relates to pay equity. But there's nothing that crosses borders. So what you might have in the United States compared to a Canadian worker, I don't believe there's not. Well, I know there's nothing that is out there that exists now that would suggest that you have to have that pay equity. You know what I mean? They're two different countries, two different marketplaces. Not only that, there's nothing that I've noticed on my radar, and I've done more than my lion's share of research on this that suggests that anything like that is on the radar as well. So you're probably, if you're that American-based company worried about that, in my estimation, you're safe right now, and for years to come.
What are your thoughts of Alberta passing legislation on this? Do you think that will happen eventually?
I like Alberta. We've been out to Alberta. We've been out to Alberta a few times. We're going back next month for another conference and speaking there. As I say to our friends in Alberta, I go, traditionally, you've been the most right-wing province of our jurisdiction of all those in Canada. You've been more employee friendly than not. But the last time we were there, I spoke to this. The courts in Alberta have caught up, and that's just the way it is. And as political pressure, especially as it's become this way across the world, but Canada is becoming this way more so even. And again, with HR folks, politics is so important. HR agendas get driven by political agendas. It's big because the employees are the biggest class of voter you get. If there's an election in Canada and Polyev were to be in over Trudeau, for example, you should expect a more aligned Canadian economy. If there's a more aligned Canadian economy, you should expect more aligned employment legislation, which means it's more likely than not that Alberta will be following the footsteps of the Ontario and the BC, who bridge them as powers, economic powers in each end. Alberta typically eventually comes around. They're just more resistant to it. And they have good reason for it, by the way, because they have specific niche industries in Alberta that make a lot of money that aren't necessarily making as much as they could be right now. That election might change that, which means that it's more likely that pay equity legislation, pay transparency legislation, begging your pardon, would find its way to Alberta.
Good question here. How does this relate to summer students?
It is a good question. In most ESAs or ESCs, Employment Standards Act, Employment Standards Code, there's a few different variations of that during jurisdiction. Summer students who are still in school, et cetera, are exempt. So as well as most pay equity legislation, they're exempt as well. There could be practical, and I'd have to look into this because I've never heard that question before. It's a great question. There might be something within a particular employment standards or a pay equity act that says students have to be paid within not compared to full-time, part-time, all that kind of stuff, but students within being compared to another student, a male student, a female student, might have to be, aligned. But as far as pay equity and students, there's nothing that I'm aware of, as students are exempt from most employment legislation across the country. But I will look into it because that's a great question, especially with summer, while summer's gone. But I'll be back soon, hopefully.
Okay, what will happen if we do not, so the rules change in 2-3 years? What will happen if we don't have a pay equity structure in place? I know we don't know what the consequences will be, but what would you anticipate could be some of the repercussions?
Well, pay equity is a law now, and it's been a law a long time. So pay equity, if you have 20, for example, in Ontario, if you have 20 employees in Ontario, you have to have a pay equity plan, and it has to be in place. So that's a law. So we're by that. That's pay transparency is a law, pay equity is a law. So you need to be there now. And if any person within your company complains about pay equity, either the Ministry of Labor or the Pay Equity Commission can come in and take a look, and they can fine you. If you break pay transparency laws, depending on which jurisdiction you are, BC is very sketchy about what they said is a fine or not. The other provinces, Newfoundland, PEI, Ontario, it could be anywhere from $1,000 to $50,000 fine per. So, depending on which jurisdiction you go to, right? So the pay fairness thing is a little bit different. With the pay fairness things, it's going to be market correcting. So if you look at the one and only example we have of pay fairness in Canada, when you go back to the WIN legislation, it wasn't so much that the fine was the hammer on the wrist, if you will. It was the fact that when they went in and did an audit, if they found that you had salaries totaling $300,000 that were lesser than what they needed to be because you did not do your pay fairness plan or couldn't justify certain raises, et cetera, they would just simply order you to pay all those people more. That's a significant cost. It'll cost you way more than any other fine, as opposed to the $5,000-$6,000 or whatever it's going to cost now to develop it. Because in 2 years from now, if it costs $5,000 to $8,000, $10,000 to develop it now, it's going to cost you 20 to 25 grand because everyone's going to need it. So it's one of those things about getting ahead of the game, if you will. And again, those numbers are all based on medium-sized employers. So, sorry.
Sounds good. Darcy, last question. It's from someone I actually talked with yesterday. So, how you doing? We have one employee who has been here for 13 years and gets the highest pay. Another employee does the same job, but has only been here for 6 months. Am I required to pay them both the same wage based on pay fairness and equity?
No, in both counts. So in both counts, both pay equity and pay fairness, again, seniority is something that is looked at as a quantifiable. You can look at it. 6 months work, 6 months contribution, 13 years contribution. You can look at it and say that's quantifiable data. We can point to that and say that's a justifiable reason why that person is getting paid that much, as opposed to it's when the data points are similar or the same. That's when the theories of pay fairness and the theories of pay equity, and they're two different things, but they're very very similar. That's when the theories of pay equity and pay transparency kick in, and the equality is required to be met. But yeah, it's a quantifiable difference. No difference that if you did have a good performance management in place, and that one person that was working for 10 years, but was a rock star producer, and you could show how they produced. And you have another employee that's been working for 12 years and has all these seniority raises, get paid less than this person with the 10 years, but this person is not a performer. But you have a performance management system that shows quantifiable data why this person deserves to be paid more than that other person who's been there for 2 years longer. Everything can be justified as long as it can be justified by criteria that is quantifiable, if that makes sense, under any of the systems.
And I can justify that it's time to end the webinar because it's 3 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Thank you very much, Darcy. We have 20 questions that we did not get to. I apologize, but that's the way it goes. It's a hot topic. We will do this again next year. Thanks very much. Again, it's being recorded. It will be sent out next week. And of course, if you need help with HR, please consider HR covered. Thank you very much, Darcy.
Thanks, Brett. Thanks, Sony. Thanks, everyone.